Well, we continue once again with our study of the biblical books. This marks a milestone. This is study number 100. We have gone through 11 sections of this study, and as we begin the book of Exodus today with chapter 1:1 verses 225, we come to the 100th time that we as a group have been able to gather together. We can be very thankful to the Lord for the blessings that He has given us for that. The book of Exodus is actually one that follows the study that we as a group have previously done in Genesis. We have looked at the creation and flood. We've looked particularly at the story of Abraham and his descendants, and as we left them, they were in Egypt. Now, we might think when we look at the Bible that it's kind of got about the same amount of material for all the different parts of it, but that's very much not the case. Between Genesis 50 and Exodus chapter 1, we have a gap of about 4 centuries, about 400 years, which is really longer than Europeans have actually had permanent dwellings in the region that we now call the United States. So that's a long, long period of time. We might remember that Joseph and his family lived up in the Nile Delta, and they were shepherds. The time period when Joseph went down into Egypt is a time period that's called in Egyptian history the Second Intermediate Period. There are 3 main phases: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom for the Egyptian history, and then there's a first intermediate phase and second intermediate phase. And this second one is the time period when people known as the Hyksos were controlling the land of Egypt. What had happened was that the Hyksos came from up in northern Syria, the southern part of what is now Russia, or the USSR territories, and they had learned how to develop a chariot. That means a horse with a cart with 2 wheels that could be used not just to haul food and weapons to battle, but that had been used to actually enter into battle, and that superior weapon resulted in people coming into control over Egypt at the time when Joseph was there, and so it's very likely that the reason why Joseph is able to rise in power as a foreigner is that everybody was. Well, now the text in Exodus tells us a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph and his family. Well, that's the beginning of the New Kingdom period. There are important names, many of them with the same letters as Moses' name in them. We have a man named Thutmose III that is often identified as the Pharaoh of this time. Ramses, who is named as, or the name of one of the storage cities is named Ramses, who lives some centuries later, is also identified by some with this time period. But we get to know for sure that Moses' name, at least, is a name that's connected with the Egyptians, and the region in which they are living now in the Nile Delta had been retaken by these native Egyptians. What apparently happened is when the Hyksos came, the native Egyptians went into upper or southern Egypt and were able to finally learn how to control the horses in the same way and get chariots going, and so now they come north. That means that everybody who is now under their control, who had moved in during the time when the Hyksos had been in control, is now seen as an enemy. And particularly the Israelites have many, many descendants. Now, that's part of the blessing. That's part of the promise that God had given. I will give you descendants so numerous you won't even be able to count them. Well, during this time period then, as the native Egyptians want the workers, but don't want so many that in an uprising they would be able to fight against the native Egyptians and turn sides and turn traitor on them, there is a decision made that maybe they can kill off the males by having them strangled, probably with the birth cord, as they are being born. So these women who are in charge of the midwives are told to kill the male babies, and probably what was going on was they were told secretively to do that, and that if they were able simply to wrap the cord, the umbilical cord, around the neck of the male as it's being born, it would die at birth, and the women would be none the wiser who were giving birth. Well, these women, and we cannot be sure whether they were Egyptian women who were helping the Hebrew women or whether they were actually Hebrew women. The text does not, the Hebrew text doesn't allow us to know for sure. One would assume that they are probably Hebrew women who are involved, but that's not completely sure from the text. They say, well, when we get called to come and give assistance in these women giving birth, the Hebrew women give birth so fast that by the time we get there, the baby's born, and then it would be too difficult for us to kill the baby without somebody knowing something was going on. And thus, they try through that ruse to say we'll be faithful to God. Already here, we note something very, very interesting. We don't know much about the faith of the people in these last 400 years. We don't know who's being faithful, how they're passing on the traditions. Moses will ask in the unit that we'll study next, what am I to say when they say, who is sending you to deliver us? And then the name Yahweh, I am, is revealed. So we don't know if the faith has been corrupted by this point. It's very important to note that there are some faithful people, like these two women who are involved, but that there are also those who may have pretty much given up on God. And all we know is that they cry out in their bondage. They cry out because they are oppressed. Now, one thing that's also important to note here is that unlike the way we would expect God would act, we would think God would know that something is troubling us and would act very quickly to save us. But note what happens here. The babies are being killed, and then Moses is born, and his mother comes up with the ruse to put him in a little basket. And I must mention that that word basket is really the only other place in the Bible that the word ark is used. That's the same Hebrew word as the word used for Noah's ark. There are two different Hebrew words for what we in English call an ark. One of them, the Ark of Noah, and this little boat that Moses is put in, and the other one, the Ark of the Covenant, which in Hebrew is actually a very different word. But what's kind of interesting here is that God saves his people, now an individual, like he had saved Noah, who had been found faithful, now through a little ark, a little tiny boat with pitch on the outside that is set onto one of these canals of the Nile. Now the people again are saved without a flood having to come to destroy everything. So there's kind of little hints that would probably bring a smile to those who knew how the story was being told. But anyway, Moses is born, and he is raised then as a daughter to, or as a son of the daughter of the Pharaoh. And then we have to wait 40 years for him to grow up. So all of this is happening very quickly at this point, so it doesn't seem like many verses, but now when Moses grows up, he's now 40 years old. So 40 years have already passed, during which time the people are crying out because of all the oppression that they have. And then Moses, now knowing that he is a Hebrew, when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster hurting one of his fellow Hebrews, then he kills the man. So here we have this great lawgiver, Moses, who is going to later be sent forth from Mount Sinai with the 10 words, the 10 summary statements, the Decalogue that we often call the 10 Commandments, along with a commandment that says you shall not murder, and that's exactly what he had done. So when that's found out, then he has to flee, and he does so by the next day. He sees two of his fellow Hebrews fighting with each other, and of course one of them says, what are you going to do, kill one of us and be in power over us as well? So then he flees. And it's another 40 years before he sees this burning bush where God sends him to go to deliver the people. So there's a rather long time period of 80 years covered by these two chapters. Just by way of quick remark, from Exodus 3 then, all the way through the rest of Exodus and through the entire book of Leviticus, which is all described as being given on Mount Sinai, all the way to Numbers chapter 10, that covers a period of maybe no more than maybe 3 years. So there's a very short time period for a huge part of the Old Testament Torah, which will all be instruction. Now, what takes place then is the reason for the people being delivered is God's faithfulness. God has said to Abraham these hundreds of years before that he was going to deliver the people after they would be taken away, and he would bring them back to the land after Israel, or the sins of the Canaanites would have been fulfilled, and then he would have kept the promise to Abraham. So during this time period, God's remembering the people, watching out for them, and when they begin to get oppressed and their existence is threatened, well, then he says, okay, I'll bring them back to Canaan. When their existence was threatened in the land of Canaan because of a famine, God made it possible through Joseph to bring the people to a land that really was a very rich land. Now, when the people of that land want to kill them, God says, I will be faithful once again. And so thus the whole event that takes place as God's delivering these people is one that is part of his own plan, and it's God's faithfulness which is involved here, not the faithfulness or the faith of the people. What they are doing really doesn't matter a whole lot, as we're going to see. God will do the delivering, and part of the whole story is that he does the delivering through someone who cannot be a leader in battle. At age 40, maybe Moses could have gone forth. Maybe he had enough training that he could go forth and try and lead the people in an insurrection. But at age 80, even if he is strong as he's described to be, he certainly is not going to lead the people to victory. And the whole point of Exodus is God is the one who is going to get them out of that land, who is going to deliver them from the bondage and the oppression of the Egyptians. So the Israelites are building store cities. When the problems come along, then it's going to make matters worse for them. They are, of course, not building the pyramids. That's probably one of the worst Sunday school leaflets I ever saw, when they showed the Israelites with half-completed pyramids behind them. The pyramids were built about 2,500 years before Christ, which is 500 or 600 years before Abraham even went down to Egypt, and 12 or 1,300 years possibly before the Israelites are finally back in the land of Canaan. So they have nothing to do with the pyramids, whatever that comes at actually during the the Old Kingdom era. But as the story begins now, after this long gap, we see that God has kept the promise that they would become many, and so this one descendant, Isaac, now has resulted in many, many people. And from the 70 that went down into Egypt, we'll find out that there are many hundreds of thousands, over 600,000 males, plus the women and children. And in spite of the fact that it doesn't happen right away, God's watching out for them, he protects them, he cares for them, and even though it's going to take this maybe 2 or 3 generations, he is going to deliver them and bring them out with his strong hand and his outstretched arm. Notice that we will not have the instructions. The law doesn't come. The 10 Commandments don't come to Moses early on, where he says to the people, if we obey God, then he'll get us out of here. But first of all, God will act, and then he will bring the people. That's really the difference between a faith and a religion. A faith says that God does the primary acting and people respond. A religion is much more, what are the rules and things that you do so that you can get God to respond. So even the way that Genesis and Exodus have been put together, we're going to see the narrative story of what God has done first, and then the instruction is not going to be so that God will act, but it will be instruction to people who are now restored into a relationship. So as we get going in Exodus, I pray that our study will be a fruitful one, that we will understand very clearly not only the way in which God gives instruction, but the grace of God which precedes it, and that grace will touch us also in days when maybe we don't know what the future holds, and when we seem to be wondering when God will act. We can know, as he assures the people, I am with you, and I will act to deliver you. And he even watches over those, such as these midwives, who act in faithfulness and are thus blessed for what they have done as a result of staying faithful to God and not trying to come up with another solution to the problems of their life. God's blessings to all of us.